It's a pleasure to be with you. I want to thank the elders for inviting me to come and give a report on the work in Philadelphia. But I want to say at the outset, and I want to make sure this is clear, this is not about me. This is not about me and my family. This is about what God is doing through His people in a different part of the country, specifically Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A lot of people have been involved in that work, including the Enos family, who's sitting back there, which I'm sure most of you know. If you haven't got a chance to know them, I would encourage you to do so. They could answer a lot of the questions that you might have about the work. I want to just kind of give you an outline of where we're going today. I'm going to begin at a very, very broad view, talking about the importance of cities in spreading the gospel. I'm going to share with you two trends that I think you'll find interesting if you're not already familiar with them, that I think impact our work of the gospel. And then finally, I'm going to talk specifically about the work in Philadelphia. So we may start with this question: why move to the city? Well, obviously you live in a very large metropolitan area. I think there's about 7.2 million people, maybe more than that, here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I grew up in a very rural part of Alabama. Some of you may have grew up in a rural part of Texas or Arkansas, Oklahoma, surrounding states, or maybe other parts of the country. And it was a very big challenge for me to move to the city, especially a city that doesn't have a lot of brethren in it. When I grew up in a rural part of Alabama, the city was where you went if you wanted to go and lose your faith. And that might be the sentiment that you had if you grew up in a small town, because we all know people who went to the city, and that's exactly what happened. They lost their faith. So why move to the city? Well, I want to encourage you that it's a very strategic thing to do to take the gospel to cities. This is a map of the Mediterranean during the first century, and as you well know, I'm sure you learned from your Bible classes, the cities that are circled are all cities that Paul went to, and they happen to be some of the largest cities of the Roman Empire. The largest, as we probably know, is Rome, which at its height is believed to have about 1 million inhabitants, but also Antioch and Ephesus were, I think, the second and third largest city. And I believe during the time of the height of this trading in the first century, Corinth actually had eclipsed Athens as having more population. It was a major trading center. And so cities are strategic. They're a melting pot of culture, race, and social class. Everyone is mixed tightly together, and oftentimes, if you have a compact city, I know the Dallas-Fort Worth area it doesn't have any the same limitations as far as land as some. You go to like San Francisco and they can't go anywhere because they're locked in by that harbor. Some cities are people are squished into a tight area, and it forces different people from different backgrounds to interact. The same is true in every city, but in some cities it's more the case, such as Philadelphia. Well, when we read the Bible, we learn that immigrants come to cities. Why was Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth? Because they got kicked out. All the Jews got kicked out of Rome at that time. We read that the gospel was shared in cities to merchants and sailors and prison guards and slaves and people from all different backgrounds and walks of life. Even religious leaders were impacted by the gospel. And the social elite, we read of city treasurers and people in Caesar's household. So all these different people coming and hearing the gospel, being preached the gospel in the city. And I also want to suggest to you that influence radiates from urban centers. And we know this in many ways. If you lived in the middle of Texas and you wanted to go see a play or some kind of cultural event, you may come to Dallas or the Houston area. If you wanted to see the best plays, the latest and greatest plays, you'd have to go where? Probably New York City or some other major metropolitan area like that. Cultural ideas, economic, political, these cities have great influence that emanate from there back to other parts that are more rural. I want to show you a map here in just a second, in the next slide, showing the influence that the city of Ephesus had in the first century. We're all familiar with this. I don't know if this goes that far. You can't see that. So you see the city of Ephesus up there, but we see surrounding it the 7 churches of Asia. You may think to yourself, well, how did those 7 churches of Asia come to be? Well, we don't know exactly. But we do know that there was a lot of evangelic effort. A lot of the gospel was preached in Ephesus. And I happen to believe that because of that influence, it affected these other cities as well. If you grew up in a small town in Texas, you may have moved to Dallas to find a job, to find education opportunities, to find a better way of life. And the same is true in the first century as well. A lot of these small towns surrounding Ephesus would have come to Ephesus, heard the gospel preached there in the first century, the work of Paul and others, and then gone back and taken that message to their family and their loved ones in those smaller cities. Down here, close to Laodicea in the lower right, it's not on the map, but that's where Colossae was as well, in Hierapolis. Let me share with you two global trends that you may already be aware of, but I think that are important when we think about the work of the gospel and spreading it globally. In Matthew 28 and 19, we are familiar with this passage as we call the Great Commission. Go into all the world and make disciples of all the nations. Well, it used to be that you had to actually go to all the nations in order to take the gospel to all the nations. But did you know now that you can go to any major university, any campus here in Dallas, and you can see people from all the nations right there on our college campuses? It turns out that our universities are some of the best in the world, and people love to send their kids here. And those people end up either staying here or going back and becoming the leaders of their home countries. And so we have a great opportunity to take the gospel to all nations because they're moving to our cities. In Acts chapter 17, when Paul was preaching, he says that God has established the boundaries of every nation, all peoples, and he's never very far from them, that they may reach out and grope for him and find him. And people, as it turns out, are moving to our country. God is moving people around. You could say God's providence. God has always moved people around where he wants them. And that's my next point, is that, I'll get to this in a second. God, I want you to hold that thought that God uses migration for his glory. When we look at the total world population, you may be very shocked to hear this if you're older, but now we have about 7.2 billion people in the world. Now, what's even shocking to me is that 54% of those people are now in urban areas. Think of all the land area in the whole globe. 54% are living in an urban area, such as Dallas or Philadelphia or Houston. But it's estimated that in the next 100 years, that's going to move closer to 90%. 90%. To break that down, that last point on the slide, something that we can kind of tangibly get our heads around is 1 million people a week are moving to a metropolitan area. 1 million people every week are moving to cities. So it may be our natural tendency to think, well, I would like to come to the city for a while, work and save up enough money that maybe I could retire outside the city. But we need to think about, globally, people are actually moving to cities, and it's a great opportunity for us to spread the gospel to them. Here's a graph of that. When my grandfather was born in 1928, I think we see 1927 up there, there was about 2 billion people in the world. And as I look out, some people may be old enough to remember this time. I see a few gray heads that may be that old. When my father was born in 1952, which is about 1960, there was 3 billion people, another billion people, 50% growth. Well, when I was born in the late 70s, 4 billion people, and now we are at about 7.5 billion, on our way to 9 billion people. Never in the history of the world has there been this many people on the planet. Where are these people going? Well, as I said, they're moving to cities. Why are they moving to cities? For educational opportunities, for job opportunities, for a better way of life. Now, as I mentioned this before, God is using migration for his glory, I believe. Why do I believe that? Well, I'm not a prophet, but I look in the Bible, and God has always used migration for his glory. Think about the Tower of Babel when he told the people to go and fill the earth, and they all stood together and built a tower. Well, he made sure that they were going to fill the earth by destroying that tower and sending them out and scattering their languages. When we see God moving the Jews around, he was doing that for his glory. When he brought them out of the Exodus and put them in the land of Canaan, he was doing that so that they would be a light to all the nations, and he did that for his glory. And then later, when they disobeyed him and he sent them to Babylon, he did that for his own purposes as well. Well, how do you think all those synagogues got spread across the Roman Empire during the time of the first century, all those synagogues that Paul went to go preach the gospel to? Well, during the time of Alexander the Great, about that time, there was a great migration of Jews from Babylon to all the corners of the Greek-speaking world. And they set up little synagogues there. And God later used that for his glory. Because when the gospel went to spread, there were synagogues, and they would go and preach the gospel to those people across the Roman Empire. So think about what may God be doing today for his glory with moving people around from place to place. It may be so that they can hear and get access to the gospel. In our country, this is a hot button political issue. And I'm not trying to take either side politically, but what we do know is the U.S. Census Bureau is telling us that more and more people, foreign-born people, are actually living in our country. In fact, in 2010, it was about 13%. And I saw a statistic last night that in the next 30 years, there's going to be 30 million new people coming to our country. That's about 1 million people every year. This may be an opportunity. It's going to be a burden to our own nation, but it's also an opportunity for these people to hear the gospel. When you look at a map of the United States, there are some emerging, what they call mega regions. Here in Texas, you have what's called the Texas Triangle. You're familiar with that. From Dallas down to Houston and over Austin, San Antonio. We have perhaps the largest mega region in the Northeast. It's called the Northeast Corridor. It extends from Washington, D.C. up to Boston. And when you look at this map, you can see the huge spike, which is New York City, and the huge population density from Washington, D.C. all the way up to Boston. Another way to think about that, excuse me, is we have 2% of the land area, but we have 20% of the U.S. population. 2% of the land area and 20% of the U.S. population, which accounts for about 55 million people. Well, in 2011, my wife and I had the opportunity to go to Connecticut, which is between New York City and Boston, and work with a small congregation there. And in 2015, we had the opportunity to move down to Philadelphia. What do you think about when you think of Philadelphia? Liberty Bell, maybe the Rocky Steps at the Museum of Art, Independence Hall, Benjamin Franklin, maybe a love statue, maybe cheesesteaks. Cheesesteaks are popular. Well, I'd like to give you some more demographic information to talk about why this city is so important. It was one of the first cities founded in 1682 by William Penn. It's strategically located now between New York City and D.C., and it's the 5th largest city in the U.S., and it's right on the border. I think the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area also rivals it. We have about 7.2 million people in that metropolitan area. What's unique is we have about 450,000, that's 450,000 college students, a lot of universities. And because the cost of living is cheaper than New York City to our north or Washington, D.C. to our south, a lot of people come to Philadelphia because it's right in the middle. In fact, a lot of immigrants will first come to either New York City or Washington, D.C., and once they get established, they'll want a cheaper cost of living, and they'll come to Philadelphia. So that's driving our growth. College students who come there and stay because the job market is good. We have one of the fastest growing millennial populations in the country. The second thing is the immigrants who are coming there. The racial demographic is also interesting. In most of the country, I don't know if you can, this is kind of a busy slide, so I don't know if you can see that well. Excuse me. Most of the country, Caucasians make up the predominant racial mix, but that's not true in Philadelphia. About 45% are black or African American, followed by Caucasian. We have a huge number of people from Asia, Central and South America, and also India as well, other East Asian countries. When we moved there in 2015, the work had been there 1 year. It started in 2014 by David Rafe. Some of you may know him, he's from Texas. And also 2 brothers, Jeff Smeltzer and Scott Smeltzer. Scott is in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and Jeff works out here outside the city in Exton, Pennsylvania. It's about an hour away. And there's also a small work on the north side of town in a place called Germantown, but there was no work in the inner city. And so David and Jeff and Scott began doing work out here to the left of the city in this suburb called Upper Darby. And I'll advance the slide. This is what it looks like in West Philadelphia. It's a very urban inner city setting, but there's work going on all across the city. I'm just talking about this is where the work initially started. It's 69th Street Station, which is on the west side of the transportation subway system. And this is what it looks like outside. You may be able to relate to this. They had some building issues. we had problems finding a place suitable to meet. And so what we could find was this little small, tiny, very hideously decorated dance studio. You can see the ugly mirrors on the walls. So it presented a lot of challenges for teaching and preaching, presented challenges for classrooms, but we made it work. The group banded together and we used that until one day there was a note on the board that said you have to get all of your stuff out today. The man who owned the little Hindu he was a Hindu man. He wanted to renovate the building into a Hindu grocery store. And so this winter was coming on, it was getting colder outside, and our prospects for finding a new place to rent were very slim. And so what we did is we moved into the basement of our little, the house that we had leased. Me and my family, they had a little small basement area, and this was a hard time for the congregation. It was a hard time because we were all crammed into this small basement space. We didn't really have any room for classrooms. It was hard to invite visitors down here into our basement. But I want to tell you something. This adversity really brought the congregation together. And I want you to think about that. When congregations go through hard times, it brings people together in ways that you would not expect.
They're all smiling.
Pardon?
They're all smiling.
They're all smiling, yes. We were happy to be there. We were happy to have a place to stay. And so as spring came on, we were looking for a new place to stay. We looked all over the city, it seemed, and nobody wanted to rent to a religious organization. Because we were in the city, we could not afford to buy a dedicated meeting space to have available to us all week. We had to look for what you may call event space that you would rent for just the times that you needed it. Many people turned us away, and then providentially we were able to find a place, and one of the most unlikely places that we would have expected. We would never have expected to get a place like this at an Ivy League school, which is the University of Pennsylvania. It's the oldest student union building in the whole country, and it's a very historic building, very beautiful building, and they let us meet in their very big, it's like a ballroom on the second floor. It seats about 100 people, so it's not quite a huge ballroom, but it's a very well-suited space. But still, we have that just on Sundays. So on Wednesday nights, we meet in another location, and we meet at Sundays at 10 a.m. We do something similar to what you're doing now, is we have two services, two lessons, right at the beginning. We don't meet in the afternoon. This is what the space looks like on the inside. Now, I want to share with you some of the personal challenges, some that you may face here, but we've often faced there, and people who move to the Northeast or any large city where there's not a large support structure and there's not a lot of brethren, you're going to run into these things. Well, first thing we noticed when we moved to Philadelphia is just the higher cost of living. I lived in Atlanta for 10 years before I moved, so I knew about higher cost of living than rural areas, but when I moved to the Northeast, I was shocked because everything is more expensive and you pay a lot more for a smaller living space. I'll give you some example. There's no garages. There's no lawns. Most everyone's children have to share bedrooms. It's very difficult living inside the city. Now, if you go out to the suburbs, you can find these things. One of the challenges that we have is being in the city but not of the city. And I think you have this in Dallas as well. There's also safety concerns. You may have read in some of my reports, I live on one side of the city, David Rafe lives on the other side, and there are safety concerns. In fact, if you follow the news, it can become quite depressing. About once a month, it seems like someone is shot and killed within a couple blocks of our house. We go outside and we're playing and we hear gunshots and we have to bring our children in quickly. That's happened on several occasions. So there's a real tension between wanting to reach out to the community and help, and then when something like this happens, your natural instinct is to hide. So hide or help, and we're always struggling with those two emotions. And then you have the common distractions. It's easy for people to move to the city and get caught up in their career, all the things that there are to do in the culture, and you understand this living in Dallas. I'd like to talk now about some of the challenges we face uniquely, perhaps as a church. Not uniquely, but some that we do face. Retaining members. During the first year and a half, when the group was really small, I think there was about 10 people or so that obeyed the gospel and were converted. And I'm sad to say that all of those fell away. And it's hard not to take that very personally. In fact, I was telling some people last night, I think it's healthy to evaluate that personally, to think, what could we have done differently? How could we have perhaps retained those people? But as I was talking to Jeff Smeltzer and some others who had started new works, they said that they had experienced similar things, where oftentimes you move and there's people who quickly obey the gospel, and we know the parable of the sower is the same, but we're looking for those who will produce 100-fold. We're looking for those who are going to be fruitful in the kingdom. And I'll share with you in just a moment some very encouraging stories. But these are some of the disappointments we've had since working there. There's also cultural, racial, and socioeconomic barriers. In like many parts of the country, well, let me just say this. I think that a church should be as ethnically diverse as the community that it's serving. Do we agree with that? I mean, the gospel knows no color, and so if you live in a very culturally diverse community, the gospel should reflect that same cultural diversity. But unfortunately, in Philadelphia, you have a Chinese church, you have a Spanish church, you have a black or African American church, and you often have white church. And that's not how it should be. In fact, we want to reflect that as well, and that is oftentimes a barrier. There's a lot of racial tension, not only across the country, but especially in Philadelphia. It has a history of tension racially. That is 2 blocks from our house is Malcolm X Park. There's a lot of Muslim influence, which I'll talk about in a moment. A lot of people here may be culturally Christian. Well, in my neighborhood, there's a lot of people who are just culturally Muslim, black Muslim. They may not be devout, just like people who are culturally Christian aren't devout Christians, but there people just may wear Muslim garb, but not necessarily be Muslim. So there's a lot of those kind of barriers that we have to be aware of and be respectful. For instance, I would not be cooking a pork roast in my backyard knowing that my neighbors would be offended by eating pork, even though it's my right to do so. I think you understand. Another thing is lack of leadership. You may be surprised to know that not a lot of people have plans to retire in Philadelphia. Does anybody have plans to retire and be an elder in Philadelphia? A lot of people, when they get older and they'd be qualified to be a leader in the congregation, may be looking for cheaper places to live. A lot of people move there to start their career and move elsewhere. And I think this is going to continue to be a challenge. And so our goal, and I really believe that the long-term viability of the church must be to convert local people who have strong roots there and plan to stay. We've been very blessed to have people who have moved there for a short period of time and leave, but this is not going to be sustainable for the long-term viability of the congregation. Another thing is we have no permanent meeting space, which means no classrooms. Everybody can identify with that? No classrooms? Well, this is what we deal with all the time. And it is a challenge. Fortunately, we're smaller, and we've tried to think, how can we equip the parents who are there to teach their children at home during this time, and how can we come up with other opportunities? And we've made it work, but it may not be seen as ideal. And then one thing we take for granted, you could get here, I'm sure, probably 5 minutes early, and you could find a great parking spot just outside, but that's not going to be the case in Philadelphia. If you come there just a few minutes early, you're going to be 20 or 30 minutes late. And so you have to prepare and come. If you're going to take public transit, you have to plan to come early, and then maybe you'll be on time, because there's always unpredictability in terms of parking or public transportation. I'll share with you one statistic. People in my neighborhood, 65% don't even have access to a car. Isn't that shocking? 65% don't have access to an automobile. That means there's no automobile in the family. Now, fortunately, there's good public transportation, but I'm sure most of you have 2 or maybe 3 cars. We just take it for granted. I've had a car since I was probably 16, and many of you have as well. And so this is something that is very, very different. A lot of people walk to worship, or they take public transportation to worship on Sunday. Well, I don't want to be all grim. My wife says, don't make everybody feel sorry for us. We enjoy working there, okay? I want to make that clear. We feel very useful there. We're happy to be there. This is a picture of the group that was recently taken before I left, and actually several people are missing from this, but it's a good group. And I want to tell you and share a story just about one couple. That didn't actually show up too well on the slide, but it's the man and the woman on either side of that little slim oval. This is Meredith and Justin. Well, Meredith grew up in New Jersey, and at a small congregation called Fairlawn, and that work had been going on. It was established there maybe like 30 or 35 years ago. I don't know the exact date, but She grew up in that congregation. Her parents were converted because, I think her grandparents were converted because they heard some Christians singing in the house next door. They had had some people over. You just never know that kind of influence. And so her grandparents ended up becoming Christians, and then her parents were Christians, and now she moved to Philadelphia to take a teaching job. And she met Justin, very well-mannered young man, but not a Christian. He was a Catholic, and he worshiped with us and studied with us for about a year. And then about 2 years ago, before they got married, he obeyed the gospel. And we were concerned, is he just obeying the gospel because he wants to marry Meredith? We had our natural concerns, but I'll tell you, he jumped in and really applied himself. Not only does he come to the assemblies on Sunday and Wednesday night, he also regularly attends a study on Tuesday nights, one of our community studies. And he's also involved in helping up, because we have to set up and tear down for worship every Sunday. He's very involved in that as well. Well, Meredith's sister started worshiping with us, and she is dating a young man who's not a Christian. And he worshiped with us for about a year. And then he obeyed the gospel. And that's Mike, that's being baptized. And he's being baptized by Justin, who was converted about a year previously. And both of these young men are just a real big encouragement to the whole group, because Mike has already started, in the last 2 months since the Enos family left, started reading scripture, and he comes early and helps set up the projector and set up things, and so he's really just started taking to the work. And he's not just coming on Sundays and on Wednesdays when he can, because he has to work, but also he's involved in a weekly study in the community as well to support that. And so he's really applying himself. For the next few moments, I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we outreach in the community. The most contacts we get are from what we call these public Bible studies. We meet, you may be familiar, I'm sure there's some like this going on in the Dallas area, if not with this congregation, with others. Maybe you've done this in the past. I think I was talking to some people last night. But we meet at like a Panera Bread or a Chick-fil-A. I'll give you a hint. Any place that gives free refills is a good place to have a public Bible study. And I'll tell you why. Because they're not rushing their patrons out the door. They want people to stick around. So if they give free Wi-Fi and free refills, ask the manager if you can have a weekly Bible study there. And we buy food, we buy coffee, and we get to know those people week after week. We meet the wait staff. What we do is we read through a book of the Bible, maybe a chapter, half a chapter a week, and discuss it. So whether any visitors come or not, we're encouraged. And we get a couple brethren to commit to that study, and then we start promoting that Bible study on social media, Facebook events, meetup.com, and Instagram. There's a lot of people who have a bad taste in their mouth, who would never come in the doors of a church building, but might sit down with you, especially if they're your friend or your neighbor or your family member. They might join you at Chick-fil-A on a Monday or Tuesday night for a Bible study. And so it might be something that you would want to consider. Following that, we have a little ad in the newspaper that we get a lot of contacts from. And then the posters and the flyers, but the highest number of contacts come from these studies out in the community. For the next few moments, I'd just like to walk you through some pictures and show you some of this. This is us meeting at a local Panera Bread downtown next to the convention center. It's right downtown. Here is David Rafe and some of the others meeting at Wendy's. And here's a list. Every night of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we have our group Bible study. Thursday and Friday, we're out somewhere in the community, different parts of town, promoting these studies in the community. And we ask our members, if possible, to support the study that's in their community, in their neighborhood. So I realize in a large city like this, there's large travel distances. It's the same way in Philadelphia. So we ask those people, if they can, if it's possible, to commit to supporting that study that's in their area. And also, the ladies, I've been very pleased with this. I think Jana's in this picture too. Yeah, Jana and my wife. They have what may be considered like a vacation Bible school for kids in a park. It's a little pop-up. They take a 10 by 10 tent, and this is a park where there's soccer going on Saturdays. And so I think this series, they were doing the whole story of the Bible for kids in like 6 or 7 weeks. And each one, they had a Bible lesson and a craft. We met several people like that. And then we also, like you do here, we have gospel meetings, but we don't call them gospel meetings because nobody understands what that is. We call them Bible lecture series. We call them a Bible lecture series, and it'll be a particular topic. And for the last 4 years, the ladies have been having a ladies' day because there's not many congregations in the Northeast. We have ladies that come from New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, the surrounding states in the Northeast. And a couple weeks ago, they had this. I think they had like 40 or 50 women in attendance and several ladies from the community. And so this is a way for the ladies to get together, who are often isolated, come together and encourage one another. Here's our recurring Facebook events, one of those that we have online, our meetup.com page where we promote Bible studies. Just a really simple newspaper ad, wanted people to study the Bible. You can't get more simple than that. It has our phone number and our website. And then again, all these different mediums that we're advertising, we're driving people to our website, and when somebody comes to our website for the first time, we just ask for their email address. We assume that they want to be there because they want to be notified about events, and we say, can we keep you notified about upcoming events? We capture their email, and that allows us to follow up with them. Again, we post flyers. We have a map of different flyers and laundromats in our community, and these are places where we know that we can post bulletins about our upcoming events. And then last summer, started an internship program, a 10-week, small-length internship program where a young man can come and spend the summer with us. Last summer, it was Alexander Newman from Atlanta, and we just help him with his preaching and his teaching and do some street work with him. And now he's just finished up FC, and he's going to be preaching in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. We have another man that's coming with us this summer. And I'll just put a plug, if you know anybody who may be part of a longer-term preaching internship but would like to spend the summer with us, let me know. Or if you know a young man who may be thinking about preaching, we'd be happy to talk to him about that. I will say that it's hard to do everything. I mean, it's hard to teach him. I mean, what do you teach a guy in 10 weeks? Because normal preaching internships are like a year, 2 years long. But we thought, well, we can offer perhaps a unique experience being in the Northeast, being in an inner city urban work, that they could get a taste of what this work may be like, and it exposes people to the work in that part of the country. And we also set up some appointment preaching for them and other congregations there in the Northeast. They're within driving distance, within a couple hours. Here's a map of where we're located in the city. I'm on the west side, me and my family, and David Rafe is on the other end of the transportation line. And this has turned out to be very strategic because depending on where we get contacts in the city, we can divide and conquer. He can follow up with those that are in the north or northeast, and we can follow up with those that are on the west side. In 2016, we had the opportunity to buy a little row house, and this has been a great opportunity for us to actually, in a place where we don't have a permanent meeting space, to have people into our homes. On Wednesday nights, we invite the young people, some of the young professional ladies to come and have dinner with us. And you just improvise. This is our backyard, which is a little, almost like a 15 by 15 with pavers. And we just, open our home up and have people over because a lot of the people that move to Philly for work don't have, they obviously don't have family in the area, so we want to be a family to them. But what's also interesting is in the Northeast, it's very unusual for people to invite others into their home. In fact, they would almost think you're trying to kill them if you invite them into your home when you first meet them. But after you get to know them, it means a lot to invite someone into your home because that's unusual. I'm sure the same is true here as well, but it's perhaps to a greater extent where we live. It's very common, like I said, for people to walk to worship, and that's our family walking to worship. And I just want to close with this. This is a passage that's very dear to me. You're familiar with it, I'm sure. It's Matthew chapter 9. It talks about the compassion of Jesus. He says, seeing the people, he, Jesus, felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dispirited, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest. And so as you're praying for the work in Philadelphia, and I do ask that you do that, I hope you would pray for some of the things that I shared, some of the challenges that we're having, but also pray that two things that come to mind, that we'd be able to retain those people who obey the gospel, that help us to have the patience and the knowledge to teach them in a way that would be helpful to establish them and develop strong roots in the faith. But also, we need more workers as well. So if you know anyone who's considering moving to another part of the country, Philadlphia doesn't have to be a place where you go and lose your faith. There's a good group of brethren there that we would love to embrace them as our family and take care of them as well. So thank you for your time.